Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zembler Miller.
Last year in Canada, attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions rose with 670%, according to a report of the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism. We discussed this with the Canadian Jewish leader Mark Sandler. He has appeared before parliamentary committees and in the Supreme Court of Canada on issues relating to anti-Semitism, and he recently founded the Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism, or ALCCA, a coalition of more than 50 community organizations to fight anti-Semitism. Mark, welcome. It's great to have you on our show. Thank you for coming on.
Delighted to be here.
So a rise of 670% in 1 year in Canada, of all places. It sounds like an explosion of anti-Semitism. In what kind of ways were Jews attacked in Canada, and what caused this?
Well, we saw a full range of anti-Semitic activities across Canada. These included, by way of example, the vandalizing of synagogues, some on multiple occasions, fire bombings of some synagogues through the use of Molotov cocktails, Jewish day schools being shot up, sometimes repeatedly, Jewish businesses being vandalized repeatedly, often with impunity, protests and demonstrations sometimes turn violent, but often using extremist rhetoric, such as by any means necessary, all Zionists must die, Zionists are all racist and genocidal, not only from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, but from water to water, Palestine shall be Arab. Conspiracies to violently target Jews, including a recently uncovered plot to attempt to kill Professor Erwin Kotler, one of our foremost human rights advocates and well-known internationally. So we've seen the full gamut of anti-Semitic activities on campus, on our streets, and in our institutions. Holocaust denial or distortion has also figured prominently, as has things like denial of the rape of Israeli women on October the 7th and the celebration of the atrocities that took place on October the 7th. So the list is endless. You asked me about the causes. We know that anti-Semitic incidents in Canada have always increased during turmoil in the Middle East, but here we've never seen anything quite like this. And I think people have never seen it in their lifetimes, except those who lived through the Holocaust and the events in the 30s and 40s in Nazi Germany. And there's nothing organic about what we're seeing. We saw this take place commencing on October the 8th, the day after the atrocities committed by Hamas and before a single Israeli soldier had set foot in Gaza. And if you ask me what the causes are, we have a very significant extremist element in Canada. They are recipients of foreign funding. So we see money being infused into Canada from a variety of sources, including Iran. We see the misuse of social media by the circulation of misinformation, anti-Semitic tropes, historical distortions. We see the use of radicalized faculty members who seek to indoctrinate students by demonizing Zionism and all Zionists without distinction. So we see, as a result, the marginalization of Jewish students in our campuses. We also see the deliberate obfuscation in discussing the difference between protected speech and hate speech. We have robust hate speech laws in Canada, but they're often not enforced because of the misinformation around what constitutes protected speech and what constitutes hate speech. So those are some of the things that we see, and I would add to all of that, to put the cherry on the top of this unfortunate Sunday, is that we also see that mainstream media has its role to play in anti-Semitism being fomented by minimizing or ignoring pro-Israeli perspectives, by subjecting Hamas's assertions to a lower level of scrutiny than Israel's assertions, by repeatedly failing to give appropriate attention to information that contradicts that which is being put forward. So it's a combination of all of those things that are contributing to the levels of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Canada.
So
Can we bring it down to street level? By which I mean, let's talk about the individuals. Who are the people that are doing the firebombing? Do they come from certain cultures? I mean, now we have the macro picture. Let's go to the micro.
So what I think we're experiencing is that there are a variety of types of people that are participating in these kinds of activities, everyone from jihadists, and Canada unfortunately has its share of jihadists. As a matter of fact, one of the terror groups that has been so designated by both the United States and by Canada and by Germany and by other countries is Samadoun. And Samadoun's organizers are rooted in British Columbia in Canada. So we have jihadists who are fomenting hatred and participating in the kinds of activities that we're talking about. And we also have the misinformed, the useful idiots, as some have described them, people who are accepting of one-sided narratives or what's happening in the Middle East and see it as their role to engage in hate activities. So it's a mixed bag, Phyllis. We're seeing them all, and we're seeing them involved in this kind of unholy alliance of the left wing, the right wing, the so-called progressive left that I used to be a proud member of, but which has now been hijacked in many ways. The full range of people.
But what makes
wow.
kids want to be hateful? I mean, what do they get out of it if they're not politically, attached to the issues?
Well, when I look at the kids that are involved, and you may not know this, but one of the initiatives that I'm involved in is building respectful dialogue with those who are prepared not to demonize us. In other words, I understand that students are impressionable. I understand that students are influenced by radicalized professors who are only prepared to indoctrinate instead of allow them to think for themselves, to give various perspectives and allow them to think for themselves. So if you were to go into a crowd of people in a protest in Canada and you were able to have an informed discussion with them, a number of them will not be able to tell you which river, which sea, when they're chanting from the river to the sea. A number of them have no idea, for example, how the state of Israel was created. They have no idea that two Israeli governments were prepared to negotiate a settlement with the Palestinian community that would have involved a two-state solution with largely the territorial integrity that some Palestinians suggest is fundamental. They don't know any of this. They are abysmally ignorant about the facts. And as a result, we get demonized for being Zionists when the irony is that many of us were advocates for Palestinian self-determination at the same time as being Zionists and have done more for the plight of Palestinians in our lifetimes than any of these protesters. So much of this, not for the extremists, but so much of it for the middle ground, has to do with ignorance and a lack of education about what's really going on.
And
And I
so
just,
what makes them hateful then?
right, that's what I want to know. And I just say, oh, let's go hate someone.
Well, if you ask them, they'd say we're not hating, we're standing up for Palestinians. But I never call some of the protests that take place in Canada, whether it's Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, pro-Palestinian rallies, because they're not pro-Palestinian. They're anti-Israel and they're pro-Hamas. and what makes them hate, you'd have to kind of psychoanalyze each to say how they come to this position. But they have been indoctrinated to a point that they believe that all Zionists are racist, evil, and genocidal. I heard one Palestinian protester say, "You know why they hate us? You know why they go after us? It's because we're people of color and they're blonde and blue-eyed." And I thought, Israelis are being described as blonde and blue-eyed, and that's the reason why they're going after people of color in the Palestinian community, when we now know, those who are informed now know, that at least half of the Israeli population are people of color. Many of them come from Arab countries, surrounding countries. A minority now come from Europe. There's a strong Sephardic community, of course, and Mizrahi community. So the bottom line is it's ignorance. Imagine somebody saying that we're going after Palestinians because they're people of color against that background, but they don't know any better. They don't know that 21% of Israelis are Arab, that they have equal representation in our universities, in our schools, in the judiciary and the like. And if you don't know any of this, it's so easy to have this one-dimensional view of Israel and Zionists.
So the people indoctrinating them with this misinformation is their professors, you say? Are are these Hamas affiliated professors? Are they woke professors? What should I imagine there?
You should imagine that you've got a range of people that fall into different categories. You've got radicalized professors that see everyone in the world as either occupiers or occupied, and distinguish and characterize Jews as white privilege, which is a shock to the Jewish community, which has never been treated as white privilege in its history. So you have those kinds of professors, but you also have those that are being placed in positions of authority that are outright supporters of Hamas and like organizations. I mean, when you see on a Canadian street people chanting, "Houthis, Houthis, make us proud," and these are people who have either know and don't care, or don't know that the Houthis are so oppressive to women and children within their own culture, and nothing in their philosophy should be celebrated. Similarly, when people celebrated the Iranian missile launches on Israel, you're celebrating a regime that kills women in dissent, and kills people internationally as one of the major terror governments in the world, and whose proxies operate against all Western countries. I mean, it's appalling what kind of ignorance that we see, some of it from people who are outright malevolent, and some of it from the ignorant.
What is the effect, Mark, of this rising anti-Semitism on the Jewish community in Canada, and what is their response?
Well, so you asked two questions. The first is, what is the effect? The effect is devastating. The Jewish community legitimately feels at existential risk in a way that they've never felt before. And I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I've never seen people who are so frightened, who are so frustrated, scared, and angry at what they're seeing around them, and what they're seeing is being permitted. So we're seeing a combination of emotions that include fear, and we're also seeing impact on the mental health of students who are feeling marginalized on campus. They don't feel safe in many instances. So if they put forward pro-Israel views, they expect to be marginalized and demonized. Same thing with Jewish faculty. If, on the other hand, they're not comfortable bringing forward pro-Zionist views, then they're hiding. They're hiding their core identity for fear of how they'll be treated. So we're seeing all of that take place. So that's the way they're feeling. And you're saying, how are they responding to all of this? Well, we're seeing a lot of people that are mobilizing to fight anti-Semitism. There are a lot of organizations in Canada that are working towards that goal. And that's one of the reasons that I created the Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism, because I work with the mainstream Jewish organizations, but I've always felt that Jewish organizations have responded to anti-Semitism often in silos. And we see that it's not just a Canadian phenomenon, we've seen it throughout the world. So the idea behind my organization is we have now 55 community organizations working together in a collaborative way to respond, and to respond in a way that that is strategic and not competitive. And so that's how we are responding to the crisis that's facing the Canadian Jewish community.
And could you mention some examples of
Sure.
what your alliance is doing, trying to do against this?
Sure. So I'll give you 3 or 4 examples. So the first has to do with criminal law. So we have a different attitude towards criminal law in Canada than in the United States. So we recognize in Canada that freedom of speech is not absolute, and there are certain limitations that can be imposed upon freedom of speech to protect people from being marginalized and demonized. So we have 4 hate speech sections of the criminal code that could not survive scrutiny if we were in the United States, but have survived constitutional scrutiny in the Supreme Court of Canada cases that I and others were involved in. So we're working with police to train and educate them about the tools that are available to them to address the most extreme forms of hate speech. We're teaching them about what anti-Semitism is and how anti-Zionism is the modern form of anti-Semitism. So many of them are unaware of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, or unaware of the fact.
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition
Thank you.
of
Thank you.
anti-Semitism.
So this is a definition that has been accepted in 44 countries and has now been accepted by the US government, and all agencies that are working with universities and colleges to enforce your Title VI anti-discrimination legislation are instructed to utilize and consider this definition in determining whether discrimination is taking place on campuses. And so we're working on utilizing that definition in Canada. We're working on educating and training police and prosecutors, and we're taking the position that the criminal law is being underutilized in Canada to address the kinds of extremism that we are seeing. So we're involved in the criminal law side. We're also involved in non-criminal litigation. And I wrote recently an article that urged us to give greater consideration to the use of lawsuits against universities who are failing to protect their Jewish students from extremism and anti-Semitism on campus. And at the same time as we're advocates against anti-Semitism, we are engaged in respectful dialogue. So in my view, it's important that we not only be allied within our Jewish community, but that we seek out allies in the non-Jewish community. So my alliance has membership from the Indigenous community, from the Catholic community, the Muslim, Hindu community, the Iranian community, right across the board, because in our view, this should be a concern for all Canadians, not merely Jewish Canadians, because the jihadist message that's at the forefront of what Hamas is involved in, and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and the Houthis and ultimately Iran, for whom these are all proxies, their message is, we're going after Western society. We want a caliphate around the world. This isn't just about Israel. And so that's a message that we're working on with our non-Jewish allies, and it's a powerful message when delivered to government.
Please.
And let's talk about the government. What has the government's response been to these messages?
The simple answer is that our form of government involves both federal government and provincial governments or territorial governments. And so, if I were to break this down into two categories, our federal government, and I'm not political at all, I speak to everybody in every political party because I have to. But the Jewish community has been tremendously disappointed with our federal government. In the view of the vast majority of the Jewish community, our federal government has given mixed messages about the situation in the Middle East, and those mixed messages have contributed to the problems that we're seeing in our community. So I'm hoping that people of goodwill within all political parties will see the importance of being assertive on issues of anti-Semitism. And that includes, for example, something that is already well along the way in the United States, and that is government should be committing to make funding to universities and colleges conditional upon their addressing in an adequate way anti-Semitism on campus. And we're seeing this happen with the US government. We're seeing that settlements of lawsuits are being driven by the US government's support for getting tough on anti-Semitism on campus. And we don't have the same commitments from our provincial and federal governments up until this point. And that has got to change. So the messages from our Canadian government have been mixed at best, and really quite unsatisfactory on fighting anti-Semitism.
What can you contribute to this difference of an American response, a United States response, versus a Canadian government response? Are they anti-Semitic in the government? I mean, are they the
I don't
typical British? I'm just thinking of those novels I read.
Well, it's kind of interesting because one could speak volumes about the differences since now there's been talk your president about Canada becoming the 51st state, which is not going to happen because we have a very different culture. But I think part of it resides in the fact that Canadians have always been significantly to the left politically of our American counterparts. Even our conservative governments are probably more left-wing than some of the regarded as left-wing politicians in the United States. And unfortunately now, the progressive left, and I told you I've been a member of the progressive left for much of my life, but unfortunately, a lot of this anti-Semitism is residing in the progressive left. And so it makes Canada kind of an easy target for those who would preach the kind of hatred that we're talking about. So I think that may be one of the explanations for the difference between Canada and the United States in that regard. Hard to know, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that, to be perfectly honest, because I'm confronted with the problem. I have to deal with the problem, and it's of little comfort to me to analyze precisely why we have the dilemma that we have. The question is, how can we effectively address it?
Yeah, I'm originally from Holland, and the Jewish community in Holland also, as of about 2000, the year 2000, suddenly had to deal with a steeply rising amount of anti-Semitism, especially in times when there was a flare-up of the conflict in between Palestinians and Israel. And And we have also experienced a very reluctant government at all levels of government, a very hesitating and looking away kind of attitude by the government for a long time. And it turns out that part of the reason for that is that government doesn't know how to counter this, because we're so not used to anti-Semitism anymore, and especially the entanglement with the political issue, which is the conflict in the Middle East, makes it so difficult. It's not racism in its classic form. It has to do with political. It's entangled with political opinions. So that makes it hard. Made it hard for Dutch government, and also there is a fear of. Since a lot of the anti-Semitism, at least in Holland, and from what I hear from you and what I read about Canada, it's maybe somewhat similar in Canada. A lot of the anti-Semitic incidents are perpetrated by people from the Muslim minority, and to aggressively intervene in a cultural minority is a taboo, or at least it has been for a long time.
Well, you make a very good point. So when I say that, I can't spend too much time thinking about why the difference between Canada and the United States, what I don't mean to say is that we can't think about the concrete things that the government and Canadians have done that make it easier for anti-Semitism to flourish in Canada. So, for example, again, many of us were very strong supporters of robust immigration policies that recognize the importance of adding immigrants from around the world to our mosaic, and also the importance of appropriate refugee status for those who are deserving. But many of us believe that the immigration system has been abused, and this isn't a reflection on every person or even the majority of people from a particular culture, religion, or faith, but it's a reflection of the fact that we have allowed extremists entry into Canada, and those extremists are fomenting a great deal of hatred that we are seeing. We know that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard had a pronounced presence in Canada and was only recently declared a terrorist group by the Canadian government after lobbying for a number of years to what we thought was to state the obvious. So we also have immigration policies that have been lax in addressing the appropriate screening for people that are entering Canada. And I know that we can do so much better.
Yep. A slightly a different topic, Mark. There is a fairly new phenomenon in anti-Zionism, in that movement, and that is the anti-Palestinian racism. It is a concept that is fairly new, anti-Palestinian racism, and it was invented in Canada and adopted by the Toronto District School Board. Can you please explain to us what anti-Palestinian racism is, and what the consequences are for Jews in Toronto, where most Canadian Jews live?
Yeah, and I won't confine it to Toronto because we have a very large Jewish community, for example, in Montreal and in other locations in Canada. So I'll make this of national application when I respond to it. So let me explain something at the outset. Unfortunately, Canada has been the home for some of the major movements in anti-Zionism. Israeli Apartheid Week was created at the University of Toronto a number of years ago and then spread worldwide. Now we have the notion of anti-Palestinian racism. And to be abundantly clear, we're not talking about discrimination against Palestinians because they're Palestinian. We abhor that. We don't support discrimination against Palestinian, Arabs, Muslims, or anyone because of who they are. But anti-Palestinian racism is a concept that was introduced with a definition by the Canadian Arab Lawyers Association, and it has been requested to be added to anti-discrimination strategies in government and in schools and in various institutions. The problem with the concept, because to the uninitiated, you say, what could be wrong with emphasizing that you're against anti-Palestinian racism? The problem is that it's being defined in such a way that makes all Zionists anti-Palestinian racists. In other words, it's being used as a political tool in order to further demonize Zionism and those who support Zionism. So, for example, if you disagree with the Palestinian narrative about how the state of Israel was created, if you disagree with the notion that Palestinians have entitlement to occupied Palestine, which includes Israel as presently constituted or as constituted in its creation, then you're a racist. You're an anti-Palestinian racist, according to this definition. So this is a very dangerous movement because under the guise of addressing discrimination against Palestinians, which would be a perfectly appropriate topic to address, it's really a way to advance the argument against Zionism and Zionists. And it's really just a different form of Zionism is racism being propagated through supposedly an anti-discrimination strategy.
So in this concept, if you are for the existence of the Jewish state, of a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland of the Jews,
Right.
then you are an anti-Palestinian racist?
That's exactly what the implications of the definition are, because it says, people who challenge the Palestinian narratives about how the state of Israel was created are regarded as anti-Palestinian racists. Those who challenge the Palestinian perspective on the occupation of Palestine are Palestinian racists. So if we challenge a very different political perspective, then we're labeled as racist. And this is deliberately treated as racism because being called a racist, of course, is the highest form of demonization that you can characterize us with. So that's the problem with what's going on here. And unsuspecting people assume that, this is just another strategy to fight discrimination when that's not what this is about at all.
So what are you doing about it with your alliance?
Well, one of the ways we're trying to deal with it is soon there'll be a major paper that's going to be released by those who are in some of our member organizations that kind of expose all of this. As well, we've submitted a number of briefs to the government, and we've suggested to the federal government that it cannot incorporate anti-Palestinian racism as it's being defined as part of its anti-discrimination strategy. Similarly, we're making representations to the provincial governments, to school boards, not to be seduced by the label anti-Palestinian racism, but look behind it as to the definitions that are being offered up in its support. And by the way, this is now a Canadian phenomenon, but it's already spilled over into the United States. I've seen articles in the United States that adopt the Canadian Arab Lawyers Association definition of anti-Palestinian racism and urge its adoption in institutions in the United States. So it was only a matter of time before this movement that started in Canada would spread to other countries. So
Where has it
American,
been? Where
sorry.
has it been adopted, Mark? Where has it been adopted, Mark? In Canada and in the United States? Which areas of society?
So it's been adopted, for example, as part of the strategy of the Toronto District School Board, which is the public school board for up to grade 12 in Toronto classrooms. But the term is being used more and more in universities and colleges, and I think you're going to see an increasing movement to have it adopted in institutions across Canada and in the United States. It's at a nascent stage right now, so it's at a stage where we can move powerfully to expose what it's all about, but we have to do it now while it's in its early stages.
Do
So
you know
what can our
any American organizations that are standing up that are trying to stop it?
I can't speak to the American experience at all, but I do know that some of our member organizations also are international in scope, and we've certainly raised this
Okay.
not only in the Canadian context, but internationally.
what can our individual listeners do? For
Yes.
example, do they need for people who have kids in public schools in the US, do they need to start watching for these words and see if they're cropping up and then go to the school boards and push back?
Yeah, I think they have to be vigilant to see what kinds of policies are being delivered at school boards, for example. And the parents' organizations in Canada have been very active in addressing these issues when they arise and bringing them to the attention of the public and of the individual school administrations. So I would expect American parents to be doing the same thing, being vigilant. And again, the key isn't saying that, we're in favor of discrimination against Palestinians, Arabs, or Muslims. The key is let's look at how these terms are being defined. And if they're being defined in a way that legitimately addresses discrimination wherever it occurs against whoever it occurs, fine. But if they're being defined in such a way that this is really just a pretext for demonizing Zionists and Zionism, then we have to take strong action. And I believe that every member of the Jewish community and our allies have got to be mindful of anti-Semitism when it arises, report it to the authorities, and also question your political figures about what position they take on the issues that are of importance to us as the Jewish community. So we have two upcoming elections, one in the province of Ontario, one federally, for a new prime minister and a new government. And this will be an opportunity for the Jewish community and its allies to ask the important questions of each candidate for office, namely, where do you stand on the issues of importance to us and our allies?
Yeah. And how do you expect anti-Semitism to develop in 2025? Now that Canada will get a new prime minister, you don't know which one yet, but a new one. The US already has a new president, and the war in the Middle East seems to de-escalate. What do you expect will the influence be on anti-Semitism in Canada in 2025?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that there is at least a temporary ceasefire in place in the Middle East, but we can't count upon that. We can't put our eggs in that basket because we don't know what will develop in the Middle East. So we have to assume that until there is a permanent solution to the issues in the Middle East, that it will continue to play a role in the heightened anti-Semitism that we're seeing. I don't think we're putting the genie back in the bottle. I don't think we're going back to a place that we were in 3 or 4 years ago, where many of us were complacent about anti-Semitism because we weren't experiencing it at a personal level as we are now. So I don't think we're going back to that place, and I think we should proceed on that basis. On the other hand, I think that 2025 will be a better year for combating anti-Semitism. I say that because I think more and more Canadians have been alerted to the scourge of anti-Semitism. I think they're beginning to realize that it's not just about the Jewish community, but it affects all of us. And so we're seeing more and more non-Jewish Canadians allied with our cause. And I do think that the majority of Canadians do not support anti-Semitism. I think the majority of Canadians do understand the issues, or at least are neutral about the issues. So our task is to empower those who have been silent to speak, to empower our non-Jewish allies to join us, and to act collaboratively in a way that our strategies will start to pay dividends in reducing anti-Semitism.
I like that very much when you said acting collaboratively. Would you like to add anything else before we end this fascinating conversation?
No, I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell you about some of the things that we're doing. People should feel free to go on to www.alcca.ca, which is our website. Every Sunday, as I know you know, I do an editorial, or others within the organization do an editorial, and they're detailed and they outline both the facts and the law in addressing specific issues on anti-Semitism, and they all have relevance not only in Canada but also to elsewhere in the world. All I can ask is that people follow what's happening in Canada, support us in our work as we work not only collaboratively within Canada but internationally to address this dilemma.
And we will share that URL with the description when we post this interview. And I thank you, Mark, so much for taking the time to catch us up on what's going on with our neighbor to the north. I thank our listeners for listening. Those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we end every episode, we say, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.